Good morning. My name's Gary Kofinas. I'm recording this from Fairbanks, Alaska, where it's 8 o'clock in the morning on a Monday, and I will be talking briefly about the adaptive capacity and transformative capacity chapter, which is, I believe, part 3 of this Arctic resilience report. My co-leaders on this particular effort are Doug Clark and Gret Hoverud. Neither of them can be in Kautokeino, and we send our regrets, and we wish you a really wonderful meeting there. What we've done is prepared some slides that just lay out some of the different parts of the writing as we imagine them coming together. We feel like we're still at the beginning stages, but pen is hitting paper and we're starting to produce some text. So I will run through my slides and give you a sense. The objective of our chapter is to present key concepts and theories as related to adaptive and transformative capacity and put them in the context of the Arctic. We will be primarily drawing on current literature, which is to say, of course, this effort isn't about primary research. We'll be looking to a number of collaborators that we're starting to talk with about contributing helpful information that can ground the project and make it more than just literature and theory. We will be focusing on the conditions that facilitate and constrain adaptive and transformative capacity, and we'd like to consider those with respect to general and specific resilience. And I assume that folks there know what that means by now. And in our work, we'd like to come up with a set of plain speak recommendations. And we understand that recommendations may not end up as a part of our chapter, but it's in some ways our contribution that can go to the general piece. So we'll just start with some key definitions of adaptive capacity, or if you'd like, you can call it adaptability. I'll be referring to it as AC through this little PowerPoint. The capacity of actors, both individuals and groups, to respond to, create, and shape variability and change within the state of a system. So we're working within a state. We have not seen a regime shift as we adapt. And transformative capacity or transformability, TC here, the capacity to reconceptualize and create a fundamentally new system with new characteristics, which in most cases means different control variables that define the system. A key aspect of both these concepts is the idea of human agency. We're not talking about a regime shift that just happens. We're talking about the capacity of humans to shape what happens to these systems. So human agency is a central part of the discussions that we're considering. Let's see. I thought I'd just throw in a few little pieces from the literature. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Billy Turner's vulnerability framework from his quite well-known paper in PNAS and other places. The point I wanted to make by showing this exposure, sensitivity, resilience piece is the part of the equation, if you will, that we're considering is this part that he calls resilience. You could say that it's synonymous with adaptive capacity. And so it's this back end, after we think about the exposure and sensitivity of the system to change, we have to see how the system might be able to respond to those changes. And just one more figure to this one from Schmidt and Waddell, giving us a sense of the coping range of extreme events and posing the question of what happens when you get outside that coping range. And so adaptive capacity helps us define what that range is, if you will. So we'd like to include some writing, not a lot, but some in here about the rationale for thinking about transformative capacity, putting that in the context of the history of the Arctic, of change resulting from maybe limited adaptive and transformative capacity, or maybe a lack of awareness of those, and what the social consequences have been, for example, relocations of communities, loss of trust through imposed harvesting regulations that weren't necessarily culturally sensitive or even ecologically accurate, issues with poverty traps and dependencies that have historically created problems. Another key rationale are the rates of change and the scales of change that are happening today in a new institutional context. And I think most importantly, understanding and enhancing adaptive capacity are the means by which humans can respond to address challenges of human well-being. In other words, this is the one place. This is the one place where we can do something about it, so to speak. So it's our means for preparing for the unknown future. I refer to it as the unknown future because I would like us to embrace the idea of resilience, which is to work in conditions of great uncertainty. So we've also had a number of discussions among us about this notion of security, and I wish Doug were here. Maybe he'll chime in if he's online during the presentation, in that there's been a lot of questioning recently challenging this notion of security, and in some conclusions, particularly among the policy scientists, is that it has limited utility. Instead, we need to think about threats, mitigation, adaptation, conflict, culture, and some of these more tangible pieces. And I will defer to Doug to elaborate on what those issues are around the concept of security. We've also talked about issues of scale and how adaptive capacity has to be thought of with respect to specific scales and nested systems. So this little diagram gives you a pretty obvious sense of how things are connected. The livelihood literature is very focused on households as a primary unit of analysis when thinking about adaptive capacity. That's often where things happen, and they can happen quickly, and so we don't want to just think about communities. We want to think about it at different scales. This is probably the most important slide that I'll flash up here, and it's a bit of a laundry list, but it's a list that's generated a lot of discussion, and I don't think the list captures all those discussions, but these are the elements or sources of adaptive capacity that we've been talking about and we're going to flesh out in the writing. And some of these I'm sure you've seen before, but all these are different kinds of capital, and the capital are those sources. Natural capital, we think about flexibility, free passage of resources. We think about supporting ecosystem services. I have diversity in parentheses because, as we found in the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, diversity may in fact increase in a changing Arctic, and that may come with a downside. So just thinking about improving diversity in and of itself may not be the best way to look at this. Human capital, of course, is critical. There's a lot of talk about leadership when we think about adaptive and transformative capacity. Skill levels, individual resilience. Something that probably is underrepresented in the literature is the role of financial capital, money, investments, and all kinds of support that can be provided. So some of our discussions about how communities have responded to changes in fuel prices show that some communities that are not as well off as others have a much harder time. They don't have the cash reserves to buffer through the hard times and help a population or constituents make ends meet. Organizational capital has to do with flexibility and responsiveness, the effectiveness just to get stuff done. This is where social learning takes place at the organizational level, and producing knowledge, being able to have access to data, be able to make projections and even predictions about the future is all part of sources of adaptive capacity. Institutional capital is about translating concerns at whatever level they occur to policy and action. Part of that is cross-scale linkages and some configured in different ways. Polycentric governance is touted as a really critical piece to adaptive capacity, given that there's no way of predicting what the future may bring. And we also, and parenthetically here, note how institutional systems can undermine and in some cases disempower people and reduce adaptive capacity. Our cultural category is where we will talk about ways of knowing, learning from tradition, sense of identity, those pieces that give people a sense of common cause and some insight into how things have been and how they can be done in the future. And our final one on this list is the idea of social capital. Social capital tends to be defined in two ways. Sociologists like to talk about trust and collective action, the capacity of a group to come together and solve problems. It's often the outgrowth of certain kinds of institutional arrangements. But the economists like to think of social capital in terms of access to resources, your ability to get to the person, the people who have information. And so that's where issues like bonding and bridging networks come to play. So it's a bit of a laundry list, but we will be peppering this with lots of Arctic examples. Some of the key elements that come out of the literature, and I think just the case studies, is that entitlements are really critical, and we want to make this point in the chapter. And the ability of the social system to learn from disturbance, to learn from past experience, where appropriate to experiment, and a lot of this really rests on social, economic, institutional, and political structures. To some extent, the natural capital is important, but often that is sideboards, and within what you have to work with is in these other pieces. We're going to talk about the dynamics of adaptive capacity, making the point that coping is different than adapting, the whole process of getting out of traps, lay out some of the tools for enhancing social learning, such as scenario analysis, participatory scenario analysis, decision support tools. All these can be participatory. And then how innovation can be facilitated. It just doesn't spring out anywhere. This next little figure is from Francis Wesley, who has made great contributions to the resilience literature, looking at the adaptive cycle and thinking about what kind of innovation strategies are appropriate at different phases of a system's change. So again, trying to link these together with Arctic examples is our objective here. Moving on to transformation, and borrowing a slide from Terry Chapin, we know there are limits to adaptation, and there's some cases where you have to think beyond just making minor changes and staying within a particular state. This is a figure that we've developed to think about social ecological systems. On the left, you have exposure and sensitivity, and on the right, in the middle there, you have adaptive capacity, learning, coping, innovating, adapting. This is very much adapted from the Turner figure that I showed earlier. What I want to point out is this: the right-hand side is that as changes occur, the system may persist, which means adaptive capacity the system was successful in staying within its state, or it may unintentionally transform, or perhaps through the actions of humans actively be navigated into another state or intentionally transformed. So the issues have to do with how do we avoid an unfavorable state change, avoid thresholds, and build resilience. How do we shape and navigate potentially favorable state changes? How do we selectively reduce barriers to state changes by planning ahead and navigate the transitions? We can look to political ecology for some of the insight there, and build resilience and transform the state by doing some good resilience planning. This is a figure from Folke et al. That has a number of examples. I think that the 4 blocks on top are worth highlighting. It's just thinking about initial states, causes of change, triggers of change, and alternative states, and this just being one framework for understanding transformative capacity. What we've been talking about are the dimensions and dynamics of transformative capacity, the capacity to anticipate a threshold, what are the triggers of unintended transformations, what are the cross-scale interactions, how do you prepare for potential windows of opportunity that may come up, how do you reduce the likelihood of unintended transformations, and transforming governance here is a really critical piece. Creating new organizations, developing bridging organizations, shadow networks, thinking about new kinds of configurations of networks, reducing hierarchy, and in some cases creating redundancy. The literature on transformation talks a lot about leadership in the context of collective action, and also the process of building new regimes. So this is a figure from Gunderson and Holling, thinking about the cross-scale interactions and triggers, and how we can ground that in the context of the Arctic, from the village level interactions to global scale changes is something we're going to try and describe in the chapter. And finally, here this is talking about different kinds of learning. We're all quite familiar with single loop, which is kind of trial and error, double loop, which forces us to reevaluate assumptions and think about key relationships in mental models. And finally, this is final triple loop learning has relevance to transformation in whether we do some change in governance, where we consider whether to alter the rules for decision making and reevaluate the process. And hopefully I can mute this. Good timing. Okay.
Call from UNISO.
Okay.
Call from UNISO.
Okay. Sorry about that. We're getting towards the end. This is the beginning of, this is a first shot at a table that has columns called the force for change, the effect, the optional responses, the enabling conditions, and the constraints. We'd like to move from general resilience to some discussion about specific resilience and how, and the adaptive capacity to respond to specific forces for change affecting the system. And there's an example of increased fire frequency, which has the effect of changing ecosystem services and potentially affecting human safety, with the optional responses being, fighting fires, or another alternative is to reduce fire load in the forest and use it to create local energy production. And some of the enabling conditions might be having the right fire policy, making profit from this whole enterprise, having sufficient fuel to do it, and access to human financial resources to start such a thing. And the constraint might be competing demands and conflicting interests. So this example is taken from one village that I'm familiar with in interior Alaska that's actually implemented this. Towards the end here, we don't have them listed, but we are going to include a set of plain speak recommendations that we hope will be either included in this chapter or put somewhere else in the full report and we're in touch with a number of people and still contacting folks to be contributors to this chapter. So with that, I wish you a wonderful meeting and hope this was helpful. Take care. Thank you.